This is the Europe and Russia region theme lecture. In the last lecture module, we looked at how humans use the land. We talked a bit about basic economic activities, some of the inequities in land, food security, and some of the environmental problems associated with how humans use the land. In this module, we're going to be talking specifically about human populations, or demography as it's known. We'll talk a bit about basic measures of demography, then population structure, an important geographic theory called the demographic transition, and then we'll talk a little bit about migration and refugees. There are a number of basic measures of population. One of the most basic is something called the crude birth rate. The crude birth rate is the number of births that takes place in a sample population of 1,000. In the United States, for example, in 2017, according to the Population Reference Bureau, in a population of 1,000 Americans, 12 babies were born. This measure helps us to understand how many children are being born, but it can be problematic. It's particularly impacted when a population is quite young or quite old, and there aren't a lot of women in the childbearing years. Because of that, demographers prefer to use something called the total fertility rate, which is a number that expresses the number of children that are born to an average woman during her entire reproductive years in any particular place. For example, in 2017, the total fertility rate in the United States was 1.8, which means that a woman had, on average, 1.8 children over the course of her lifetime. Now, there's a theoretical replacement rate in a population, which is 2.1 children per woman, or a little bit more. And that's because, of course, some children die before they reach the reproductive years. And as a result of that, slightly greater number than 2 children for every man and woman need to be born in a particular country. We can also look at the crude death rate as well, which again is measured out of the sample population of 1,000. In the United States, for example, 8 people died in a population of 1,000. Again, this can be a problematic number, and we'll see this very clearly on a chart we'll look at in a little bit. It's strongly influenced by how old a population is. As a result, demographers prefer to use expressions like life expectancy that tells what the average life expectancy for people are in a particular country. In the United States, for example, men lived on average in 2017 76 years and women 81. Of course, there's a lot of variability based on geography, based on income levels, and a host of other things as well. A sad measure of demography is something called infant mortality. Infant mortality is measured out of a sample population of 1,000 live births, and then is expressed as the mortality that takes place before the end of 1 year of life. In the United States, infant mortality was 6. That means that 6 babies die before the end of their first year of life out of every 1,000 born. That's less than 1 per 100, which is a good number, but actually isn't great compared to many other developed countries around the world. It's worth noting that life expectancy is strongly impacted by infant mortality. You'll see that in some countries around the world, life expectancies are quite low. That's often not because people don't live very long, but because so many children die before the age of 1, and that reduces life expectancy considerably. Here's a chart that shows 4 countries from around the world: Italy, Mexico, Pakistan, and the Central African Republic. And it shows things like crude birth rate, total fertility rate, crude death rate, etc. for each of these countries. One of the really important things to note, I think, is in the Central African Republic, we see a very low life expectancy. But again, compare that to the infant mortality rate, which is quite high. That helps to bring down that life expectancy. If you look at the bottom two rows, you'll see a number that shows the number of people who are less than 15 years old and the number of people who are greater than 65. You'll notice here that Italy's percentage of greater than 65 is quite large. As a result of that, they have a very high crude death rate. Older populations, not surprisingly, have greater numbers of deaths. So Italy has a crude death rate of 10, greater than both Mexico and Pakistan, and rivaling the Central African republics. But that's not an expression of the fact that Italians are unhealthy, rather just that they're elderly. You'll see that very few children are born in Italy, only 1.3 per woman, which means that the country is not replacing itself. There are not many young people in Italy either, which means in the future it's likely that population declines will continue in that country. All of these things allude to the very important issue of population structure. Population structure refers to the fact that we need to think about populations not just in terms of the number of births or deaths or children being born, but also we need to understand how populations look in terms of how they're structured both by sex and also by age cohort. This helps us to understand if a population is young, or if it's old, or if there are interesting sex imbalances at certain ages, or if there are baby booms or busts. I'd like you to explore population structure a bit by going to populationpyramid.net, where you can build your own population pyramids from countries around the world, and you'll find some very intriguing things there. Here are a couple. Here's the Central African Republic. You can see it's a true population pyramid. Very large numbers of young people and very few elderly people. The numbers of elderly people are small, not because people die when they're very young in the Central African Republic, but because there are so many young people, so many babies being born. Total fertility rate is quite high. Pakistan is a country with a slightly lower total fertility rate. As a result of this, the pyramid is beginning to flatten in the younger years. But in Mexico, we can see this taking place at a much faster rate. In Mexico, the total fertility rate is actually just over replacement, but very quickly falling below replacement rate. We see that there aren't many young people, and the number of people in the working ages is much greater. If this trend were to continue, we would find a country like Italy, where there are large numbers of people in the older working ages and elderly people, and very few children. Population structure is important because it helps us to understand some of the challenges that countries face. But it also helps us to understand some of the basic history behind population change that's taking place around the world. Now, for each country, there are oftentimes very specific conditions that lead to population change, but there are also more generalizable ones. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit. I'd like to talk about something called the demographic transition, which is a key geographic theory. This demographic transition argues that there are important links between, on the one hand, modernization, and on the other hand, population change. What is modernization? Modernization can mean a lot of different things. In the context of the demographic transition, it means all the different social changes that take place in a society that impact things like how families function, how food is produced and distributed, and how economies work. The demographic transition model argues that in a pre-modern period, death rates are high and birth rates are high too. Death rates are high because there's a lot of infectious diseases and famine. Birth rates are high to make up for the fact that death rates are high. Large families are important because you need to replace the large number of people that are dying, particularly infants. In addition to this, in a pre-modern period, economically speaking, the family is very dependent on children. You need to have children to replace yourself and to care for you when you're elderly. Many people live in rural areas as well, and in rural areas, children are an important economic asset. They can help in farming chores. They can help to bring money into a family. Once a country begins to modernize, though, a number of things begin to change. The most important thing that happens initially is that societies become more organized. As a result of that, food is distributed more equitably, disease begins to be controlled by a society, and death rates start to fall. Death rates are falling, but birth rates remain high, in part because it's natural to continue to have large families. As a result of this, there begins to be an important baby boom that takes place. Lots of children are being born, but not as many are dying. At the same time this is taking place, many people are moving from rural areas into urban areas. Societies are beginning to change in dramatic ways. In the pre-modern period, people relied largely on family structures. In the modern period, society begins to take over some of the things that in the past the family cared for. Things like Social Security, things like making sure that economic opportunities are available for all. A large range of things start to change dramatically as a society organizes itself to become modern and to take over many of the roles that the family played in the past. As a result of this, as a country becomes more and more modern, birth rates begin to decline. In fact, birth rates begin to decline not only because a society is taking over more functions that the family played, but because children begin to be somewhat of an economic liability in a modern world. They begin to cost more, they're unable to work as they did in the past, and in an urban environment, they simply aren't as necessary as they were before. Children, of course, continue to be born because people still want to have children, but the numbers of children are reduced and family sizes tend to get smaller over time. Eventually, the demographic transition argues, birth rates begin to fall, and they fall so much that they actually go below death rates. And when that happens, we enter a postmodern period, as we're seeing in Italy, where you actually begin to have population declines. All of these things have important consequences for population structures. As the demographic transition begins to unfold, societies tend to be very young. As a result of this, there are large numbers of young, relatively unproductive members of society who, in a non-modern society, are economically useful, but in a modern society tend to be quite expensive. They need to be schooled, they need to be fed and clothed, they need housing, and it's not entirely easy to produce that in an urban environment. However, you're also storing up great demographic potential when you have large numbers of young people. If you're able to invest in young people effectively in this early transition, you can eventually begin to take advantage of that. However, if a society is growing so quickly that it is unable to match that growth economically, you can very much have difficulties in societies. We see this in a lot of developing countries around the world today, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where total fertility rates are very high, population growth rates are very high, and economic growth rates tend not to match those. However, if a society is able to make the transition and is able to make investments in children, there are huge potential demographic dividends that take place as a society transitions. You suddenly have large numbers of working populations in a society like we saw in Mexico, with relatively small unproductive burden of either young people or elderly people yet. As a result, these transitioning societies tend to be societies that see a lot of economic growth. It's important, though, for these societies to realize that there can be huge social and environmental mortgages that they can rack up if they don't plan for the future. And the future is old societies. Many developed countries around the world today are facing increasingly elderly populations, including the United States. In older societies, there are a large number of old people who are relatively unproductive compared to what they were in the past, and tend to be quite expensive as well. In addition, investments made in the elderly at these times tends to pay very little in terms of economic growth in the future, because of course the elderly die in a short time without being able to put a lot of economic activity into a society. Old societies also face a time when a lot of social and environmental debt obligations must be met. Sometimes large promises have been made of Social Security, Medicare, and other sorts of debt like that. This all needs to be repaid by society at the same time that there are fewer and fewer young people who are going to be economically productive. Many societies have also spent a great deal of their economic growth engaging in environmentally damaging practices. Suddenly, those environmentally damaging practices begin to impact the natural resources of a country and make it more difficult for that country to continue its economic growth. Societies must prepare very well to become elderly, and very few do that, including the United States. I'd like you to think about this a little bit and think about the importance of population structure as you consider how demography impacts the world. Now, another thing I'd like to talk about in this lecture is the issue of migration. Historically, humans have moved all around the world, sometimes forced migrations, sometimes voluntary. There are a number of key geographic theories that consider migration. One of the most important of these is something called push and pull theory. Push and pull theory examines the various demographic and societal factors that push people out of one country or pull them into another one. Pull factors, by the way, tend to be the most important, especially in non-forced migration. We see this in migration to the United States, which takes place in part because of the strong economic opportunities that are found in our country. There are also intervening obstacles that block the way of migrants that make push and pull factors change depending on what those obstacles are. International laws and national laws that restrict migrants are some of the most important intervening obstacles, but things like travel costs also focus into this as well. Push and pull migration theory also looks at migration as a strategy that people use at certain key points in their life to reach some of their goals. That's another way to think about push and pull theory, not just in terms of the geographic factors, but oftentimes the age and demographic factors that encourage people to move from one part of the world to another. As we think about migration in this course, it's important to remember that modern migration is very different from migration that took place just a couple of hundred years ago. The notions of the state and what it means to be a citizen have changed dramatically. And they've changed dramatically during the demographic transition. Many Europeans, many people who came to North America and to the United States in particular, faced very few barriers to migration. This was advantageous to Europe in its demographic transition because it meant that large numbers of people that were being born were able to go to other parts of the world. Many parts of the developing world face huge intervening obstacles to migration that were not faced by Europeans in the past. It's also important in talking about migration to make a distinction between migrants and refugees. Refugees are a very distinct group in human migration. There are a number of complicated legal definitions that help us to understand what a refugee is. In very broad terms, a refugee is someone who's been persecuted in the country they're coming from. They fear for their life. They are outside of their country and they're unable to return. They're protected by international conventions that have been signed by most countries around the world. There are huge numbers of refugees in the world today. According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, in 2016, there were over 60 million people who'd been forcibly displaced, and there were 22 million refugees who were under the UNHCR's mandate. Of those, less than 200,000 were actually resettled in 2016, and that number has not improved much in the last few years. The next few slides and the last few slides have some migration and refugee comparisons. And to make these, I've used data from the Population Reference Bureau, from the United Nations Human Development Report, and also from the UNHCR. The first of these shows migration rates around the world for a number of selected countries. You'll see that net migration rates vary dramatically, all the way from 24 out of every 1,000 in Iceland to countries that are actually losing population by migration, like Pakistan, -4. Note that the United States, with a net migration rate of 3 out of 1,000, is relatively moderate compared to many countries around the world, and tends to be a little bit lower than what you find in other developed countries. The next column shows persons of concern. This includes official refugees as well as asylum seekers as well. I've listed the absolute number of people of concern and also the rate based on the population in that country. You'll see that some countries have very high rates of persons of concern living within their boundaries. These would be people who are seeking asylum, who have already received it and are officially refugees, or people who have been displaced and are not recognized by legal convention yet as being asylum seekers. Again, you'll see that the United States' rate is relatively low compared to a lot of other developed countries around the world. In the next chart, I've included the percentage of stock of immigrants. This comes from the UN Human Development Report. It tells what percentage of a population is made of people who come from another country, immigrants. Again, there's huge variation around the world, and I just wanted you to be able to make some comparisons of the United States to some other countries that I've selected. The next chart shows refugee arrivals to the United States in 2018. These data come from the National Immigration Forum. You'll see that in 2018, the total number of refugees that arrived in the United States was just over 22,000, below the ceiling set of 30,000. These numbers are significantly smaller, it should be noted, than they were in previous years. And then the final chart here shows the number of refugee arrivals to Anchorage since 2002. The rate for refugee arrivals to Anchorage is quite low, only about 0.1 per 1,000. Despite Anchorage's diversity, we have a very small total population of refugees coming to our city. These charts were just shown to help you think a little bit about migration and refugee issues. If you have any questions about demography or migration generally, please feel free to follow up.